So welcome, good evening for the most of you who are joining us here at 6:30 in the evening, and good morning to any of you who are joining from the UK or from alternative time zones. Thank you so much for taking the time to join with us this evening for a really fantastic privilege to be able to have the eclat and the moment of appreciating the advent of a new book. I'm glad when we all have time to take that opportunity to share the ideas together and learn more about them and engage with them. Before I welcome our special guest this evening, can I begin by acknowledging the lands from which we are all zooming in on? I'm not quite sure how people think about this in the UK, actually. So, James, if you wish to comment on what it means to acknowledge the various ancestors that go back into the myths of time and the many forms of traditional ownership overlaid one over the other. From where you are coming from, I'm always open to hearing that. But for the most of us are joining from unceded land belonging to Aboriginal people of various different backgrounds and nations. In my case, I'm joining you from stormy Gundungurra country in the Blue Mountains. It was recently, looked like it had snowed. There was such a thick blanket of hail upon us. I hope everybody else is joining from quieter and less turbulent, unceded Aboriginal lands. I pay my respects to ancestors, past, present, and to come. And as always, for a Create Centre webinar, I do so knowing that there is such indivisibility between country, cultural practice, and co-learning with each other, and that the spirit of that connection and engagement fuels our endeavours now, and we follow that leadership into the future. And having said so, it's now my enormous privilege to welcome us Professor James Thompson from the UK. Thank you for joining us from a lovely UK morning. Towards the end of this event, I'll also ask Michael Anderson to say a few words about the Create Centre. But for the moment, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor James Thompson. James asked me to just introduce himself as a professor of applied and social theatre at the University of Manchester, but I might put your bio at the University of Manchester into the link so that people can hear a little bit more or look a little bit more at some of the work that you've done in the past. James, as you know, is here to launch, at least in Australian terms, his new book, which I'm really thrilled about, having myself made reference to these notions of an aesthetic of care in my own recent work. And as I understand it, will also draw some connections between this particular book and previous work that you've done in your role as an applied theatre maker. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you to everyone in Australia for both inviting me to this session and also for attending on your precious evening. So particularly thank you to Michael Balfour, everyone in the Health Network at the University of New South Wales, the University of Sydney Create Centre. It's really great to be speaking to, through your invitation, to such an exciting audience. And I'm obviously recognise some faces around the Zoom screen here, both Australian friends, but also people I know who look like they're somewhere in Europe as well. So welcome to the morning for some and welcome to the evening for the others. And thank you, Claire, for also talking about land acknowledgement. This is something certainly in the UK isn't a common practice, but we obviously acknowledge the importance of it for colleagues in Australia, but also when we're working with colleagues in the north of America, both Canada and the United States, in terms of land acknowledgement. The terms of land acknowledgement don't work in quite the same way, obviously living in lands of the United Kingdom, but of course we do have histories of settlement, migration, colonialism, imperialism, that are always worthy of acknowledgement. It's just goes without saying that it's important to recognise that the history of Britain, the history of the United Kingdom, in terms of its both terrifying past and also some of the implications of that in the present today. As Claire said, this is an outrageous sort of plug for my new book, so I have to apologise in advance for plugging a new book. And it is. I'll do my product placement to start with. This is my new book called Care Aesthetics for Artful Care and Careful Art. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why this book and why I came to write this book this morning. And I'm absolutely happy to take any questions. I know Michael's going to make some comments. Michael Balfour is going to make some comments at the end. But I absolutely want to hear from yourselves in terms of responses to it. First, I'm going to just give a little bit of background because this work comes out of the history of work that I've been part of. So it isn't sort of a sudden sort of turn to a different direction. It's very much built on work that I've done in the past. I started my applied theatre work working in the prison service, working in criminal justice settings, both here in Manchester, the UK, but also in Brazil. And I did that for about 10 years, working in different prison, young offender, community criminal justice settings. I moved in the early 2000s to start working in war zones. And I started documenting the work of artists who lived and worked in war zones, and became very interested in why do artists continue to make work and work with communities in times of great distress. So what was the reasons they continued to make their work? And perhaps some of those reasons were because of the setting, because of the war that they were facing. But also I became very interested in some of the in spite of qualities of the artistic practice. So in spite of the terrible situation we are facing, we're going to continue making this work. So there was work that sought to sort of disregard the context by continuing, and then there was also work that was facing the context. This new project and the new work I'm doing around the idea of care aesthetics very much comes sort of as a result of the sort of end of my work working in war zones. And I have a sort of, some people who know some of my writing on this, a type of apocryphal story, a sort of origin story for my interest in care and the aesthetics of care. And it comes from a colleague of mine who I was working with in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He was injured in the Congo and had to come to the UK for surgery on his arm. He was shot in his arm. And he lived with myself and my family for over 6 months. We cared for him in our house, but also we took him to hospital nearly every day. And we watched very closely the treatment he had, the post-operative treatment on his arm and his hand. And there was a moment in the relationship that he developed with his physiotherapist that my wife and I were commenting on. And we both almost simultaneously used the word beautiful in our response to the relationship he developed with his physiotherapist. We thought it was a beautiful example of a relationship and a beautiful example of care. Because I'm a researcher and I'm a person interested in the arts, I became immediately interested why we'd both chosen the word beauty to describe a caring relationship. We sort of automatically lent on a word that traditionally comes from aesthetics, comes from an appreciation of art, to talk about care. And this got me very interested in what was the possible relationship, or what might be a possible relationship between care and the arts, and care and aesthetics more directly. Because I've been working in war zones, most of the work was sort of dealing with issues of suffering, trauma, distress. Suddenly looking at this rather beautiful caring relationship, it pushed me towards thinking about what might happen if we started thinking about human capacities, the things that humans can do beautifully together, rather than some of the distresses in their lives. There's, as many people know, the amazing American writer called Bell Hooks, who really sadly died last year. And she's written a really incredible book about love. And in that book, she says, she asks the sort of probing question, why are we more able to speak about loss than love? And the sort of history of North American, certainly European thought tends to focus on discussing issues of loss rather than the capacities humans have to love each other. And bell hooks' book is a sort of eulogy to trying to speak about love for each other. In many ways, for me, this example, this moment when my colleague built this relationship, started my interest in thinking about what would happen if we started thinking about human capacities, and in my place, care. What might happen if we started thinking about the fact that humans have this incredible capacity to care for each other, which I would argue has a sort of aesthetic quality. And this might mean that we can start to think about a sort of social justice orientation to the arts that, rather than starting from human suffering, starts from a human capacity, a human ability to do something quite incredible. There's another part of question that this sort of set up for me, is that if I was claiming that carers, physiotherapists, healthcare professionals could be seen as craft workers or artists, there's a question about what this means for how we learn from them. How might we actually start learning from the craft of care workers? And also, how might the craft of care be improved through the attention to its aesthetic qualities? So that's my sort of opening. I suddenly became really interested in how might care have an aesthetics? Not that it automatically does, but if I say it's something is beautiful, it implies that we might go on a journey to discover what the claim that care has an aesthetics might reveal for a whole range of different practices. And that, in a sense, is the sort of introduction to how I started working and thinking about this book. And the book is really my attempt to explore the implications for that claim that care could have an aesthetic quality. I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the book. It starts with an anecdote. It starts with the quotation of a poem, and it starts with an analysis of a chapter. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the anecdote. It starts with the poem I chose to sort of frame some of the ideas in this book, and then the chapter that I've chosen. The anecdote, again, is a Congolese reference. A Congolese friend of mine was staying in the UK, and he was just learning English. He spoke a whole range of other languages, but he was learning English. And he'd been here for a few weeks. And he turned to me one day and he said, James, why do people in England put their children in wheelbarrows? Now, I immediately was, the first thing I could have done is correct his English and say, no, they're not wheelbarrows. These are pushchairs, buggies, strollers, or whatever you wanted to call them. But there was something completely wonderful about the fact that he called them wheelbarrows, because what it immediately did is illustrate something for me about how we do in the UK, certainly, care for our children. We do tend to put them in wheelbarrows that face away from their parents. What it immediately illustrated for me is that people who comment on care, as soon as you make a comment on care, you start to criticize or reveal aspects of how relationships are produced in the countries that we live in. And also it illustrated very quickly that care is not a fixed thing. It changes cross-culturally. There is no one type of care that is fixed in different cultural contexts. So when my friend said wheelbarrows, he made an intervention in how we understand care in this context and illustrated for me that care is not something that stays the same in different settings. So one of the principles of the book is that I might say, for example, this care is beautiful or this care is ugly. But of course, that is coming from the context in which I'm sat. And like art, care is in the eye of the beholder. So it changes from the direction that you're looking at it. For many people, you might see wheelbarrows where other people might be seeing pushchairs. So that's the first thing, the anecdote about the wheelbarrow. The second starting point of the book is a poem. It's a poem by a British Trinidadian poet called Roger Robinson, who wrote a collection called A Portable Paradise. It's a beautiful collection of poetry, which I recommend to you all. And there's an amazing poem in this collection called Grace. And when Roger Robinson reads this poem, he calls it his love letter to the NHS and its nurses. And what I want to do is just read the last two stanzas of this this poem, and then just say a couple of things about it. He reads this beautifully. I'm not going to read it as beautifully as he does, but I'm just going to give you the last two stanzas. And it's a poem about what he calls a senior Jamaican nurse who is looking after his premature son, who was born and was being cared for in this particular hospital. And these are the final two stanzas. Another consultant tells the nurses to stop feeding a baby who will soon die. And she commands her loyal nurses to feed him. No baby must dead with a hungry belly. And she'd sit in the dark, rocking that well-fed baby, held to her bosom, slowly humming the melody of Happy by Pharrell. And I think, if by some chance I'm not here and my son's life should flicker, then Grace, she should be the one. For me, Grace is a poem about care, but it's also an artwork about the art of care. And art of care is a crucial theme of the Care Aesthetics book. And this is not care plus art or art in care settings. It's about the integration of care and art simultaneously. So Grace's caring work included singing, humming, rocking, and also in another part of the poem, it talks about her incredible ability to thread a line into a baby's vein. So her caring does not make a distinction between humming, singing on the one hand and highly tuned technical skills on the other. Simultaneously, they are part of her care. And this, I would argue, indicates that high quality care has a certain aesthetics. The final starting point of the book is a chapter, and it's a chapter from a book called The Politics of Care from COVID-19 to Black Lives Matter, edited by Deborah Chasman and Joshua Cohen. It came out in 2020. I recommend it to everyone. It's a really good collection that sort of looks at the relationship between care and partly the COVID crisis, but also the sort of history of movements like Black Lives Matter. And there's one chapter in this book written by the former editor of Boston's Gay Community News, Amy Hoffman. And I've chosen this chapter, which is called Love One Another or Die, to point to the importance of recognizing the different ways that care is written about and materializes in different people's lives. She discusses her experience of the HIV AIDS crisis in the 1980s, what she calls that other pandemic. And she reminds us that pandemics are not the first for many communities. Care crises have histories, they have antecedents, and they have impacted on different communities in very different ways. She also shows that care is political, both in public demands for proper provisions for people living with HIV and AIDS, and also the personal acts of caring she did for her friends. She demonstrates care as resistant and an embodied practice. So, for example, at that time, not wearing gloves to care for AIDS patients, which was a norm, most people insisted that you wore gloves. Not wearing gloves was both her caring practice, so she insisted on not wearing gloves, but it's also a radical practice. And I would argue it also has a sensory aesthetic quality. If you're working with someone not with gloves, it has a different shape and feel to if you insist on wearing gloves when you're treating an AIDS patient. Of course, it's utter appalling discrimination of people living with AIDS that at that time they insist on you wearing gloves to approach them. Her chapter reminds us that to learn that we need to learn from care histories and notice that it is both intimate and political. And something that I'm trying to do in the book is map a terrain that is both intimate and political simultaneously. So the book, it starts with this anecdote, this poem and this chapter, in many ways to say that I'm drawing this book from personal experiences, from artistic responses to care, but also more academic sort of historical responses to care. I'm just quickly checking the time. I'm sure you've got loads of questions. I want to quickly say about what I try and do in the book. It's basically making a claim that care has an aesthetics. I'm saying that care can be considered for its craft or its artfulness. And the book basically tries to justify that claim and map what maybe are the implications of it. And it's structured. The first part of the book looks at what I mean by care and aesthetics. These are the theoretical bits. So if people are not interested in theory, just jump part 1, don't read chapters 1 and chapters 2. The first, in terms of care, I look at the whole history of feminist care ethics. It was primarily developed in the 70s and 80s, and it argues for an ethics based on the practices of care in everyday life, rather than an ethics based on rules of behavior, excuse me, that rational people agree to obey. It explores how interhuman relational practices of care create situation-dependent ethical demands on people. My extension of this is to insist that care is an embodied practice, and therefore it has sensory qualities and can be examined for creating a type of aesthetic experience. Second chapter deals with this really difficult word, aesthetics, and I've had lots of people question my use of this word, and I'm very welcome. I'd welcome your questions as well. And the question comes from 2 directions, actually. One from friends saying, it's such an off-putting word, technical word, why do I use it? Why couldn't I call it the art of care or something similar? And the second direction comes from people saying that my understanding of aesthetics is completely wrong and flawed because I haven't really read my Kant properly. And I'm, of course, I'm happy to take questions from either of these points of view. My brief response to the first point about why not art of care is actually because if you say art of care, what you focus on is the art of an individual. So the art of the nurse, for example. And what that does is mean that we attend to one person in the caring relationship, rather than a caring experience that is created by 2 people simultaneously. So I talk about aesthetics because it's about an aesthetic experience created by multiple people in networks, in contexts, and in situations and environments. If you say the art of, you tend to be focusing on one person in a dyad or one person in the relationship of care. In terms of why aesthetics from a more sort of philosophical reason, I'm really happy to take questions. I'd, say read chapter 2 is what I'd say. But there are a whole range of aesthetic theories that draw on the relationship between aesthetics and everyday life that would argue that relations can have a sensory aesthetic quality. And I draw on the work of pragmatist aesthetics, people like John Dewey, the aesthetics of everyday life, relational aesthetics, and a whole range of other aesthetic theories to say that it's perfectly reasonable to say that aesthetics is more than just the history of art. Aesthetics is the history of the way people relate in their everyday lives. And I try and make the case for a broader view of aesthetics into which I can place care. So those are the theory chapters. And then the second half of the book is trying to put the idea of care aesthetics to work, I would say. It's saying, what happens if we look at care aesthetics in health and social care? What happens if we look at care aesthetics and the arts? And then there's a final chapter on care aesthetics in everyday life, particularly looking at care aesthetics and COVID. because that was the context in which I was really writing this, the final part of the book. In the healthcare chapter, I look at care aesthetics and healthcare, and I'm particularly interested in where the term aesthetics is used in health and social care outside the arts. So I try and track where health and social care practices and literature already has an aesthetic register, even if they don't directly call it that. I'm going to give you two examples. So I'm going to a quick reading of two quotes from the healthcare literature. And these are from other writers, but I just thought it's interesting to hear the way people talk about some aspects of health and social care, which I would argue illustrate there's already an aesthetic register happening in the way that care and health is written about. So this is from two writers called Chin and Kramer, who are nursing academics, and they're talking about the work of on an orthopedic, and this is what they say. They're talking about a particular nurse. Presley works in the orthopedic clinic of a large urban hospital and uses aesthetic knowing with each young child who comes for cast removal. It is aesthetic knowing that helps him remove the cast in the least distressing way for the child. Presley understands that this child likely sees a large person approaching her leg with an electric cutter and other tools that resemble those in her father's woodworking shop. Presley might use a combination of distraction and humor, as well as careful timing, to move through the required procedure in an artful way. So here we have the description from two nursing academics that talk about humor, timing, artfulness, and a sort of sense of aesthetic knowing. I use a whole range of other examples in the book, really to try and say that care aesthetics isn't something that is coming from the outside into the health and social care literature, but is also already nascent in it. Many nursing specialists, health and social care specialists speak with this sense of sensory knowledge that exists. In the art and social care, in the art chapter, I look at a whole range of different theatre arts and social arts practices. Theatre games, autobiographical performance, one-to-one performance, and then also community dance. I'm just going to read one tiny little bit from the bit about community dance, from a quote from a community dancer called Rosemary Lee in the UK. And I'll tell you why I quote her once I've quoted her. And she's talking about the sort of dance that she likes. And she says, in order to dance well and in order to rehearse well, dancers need to have a balance of acceptance of leading and following, of letting go of control, of being in control, of being just a partner. Just to pick someone up, just to dance with someone, you've got to kind of understand how they're feeling at that moment. There's an ability to connect with people non-verbally and to be empathetic that's really attuned in a dancer, especially in the kind of dance world that I'm interested in. Rosemary Lee creates incredible participatory community-based dance work. But what I'm interested in the way she speaks about dance is that she's talking about a certain attunement to people's bodies. And I would argue this is a type of care work that's happening simultaneously in the dance work she likes. And the better the care work between dancers, the better the dance is aesthetically. And of course, she says, just to pick people up, you've got to understand them in a particular way. And this, of course, could be a quote about the work of a nurse. Just to pick people up, you have to understand how their bodies react, how you react in the space in a certain way. So even though I create these two chapters, one on health and social care, one on the arts, all the time what I'm trying to do is say that the language in health and social care around aesthetics can teach us something about the arts, and the language around care in the arts practices can teach us something about both health and social care and the arts themselves. The final chapter of the book, sort of where I leave off from, is about care aesthetics in everyday life. There's a huge number of interesting projects during COVID, certainly in the UK, but I know internationally, where there was a quality of care that people gave to each other, to their communities, to older people in their communities, which I would argue has an indistinct line between where the care ended and where the art began. The way people cooked for their neighbors has, I would argue, a certain type of care aesthetics, because you both cooked for your neighbors, an act of care, but you did it with a certain craft and attention to the taste and feel of the work that illustrated you had an aesthetic sensibility in the way you were doing it. The way that people looked after children, certainly in the UK, there was a whole series of walks for children who weren't at school, so they could walk around neighborhood and see things in people's windows. So there was trails of artwork in windows. And I would argue these are caring projects, a way looking after the sort of young people, but also they had an artistic quality. So the final chapter of the book is trying to map out those projects during COVID, community responses to COVID, where there is a care aesthetics, because you cannot see a distinction between the desire to care for a community, for the people you're working with, and that sort of aesthetic attunement to them. During COVID, I actually was volunteering myself, and I set myself, I was a volunteer for people who had young children with certain types of disabilities. And I took a couple of young kids who had registered disabilities and took them out on walks and did sort of play activities with them, which we were allowed to do. That partly because they were stuck inside in their houses. And so in my time during COVID, I was writing the book during the day and doing this volunteering work with young children in the afternoons and evenings. And originally I thought my volunteering work had nothing to do with the book that I was writing. But of course, I slowly realized that one-to-one work with children running around parks and doing play work with young people with certain types of disabilities, of course, had an aesthetic sensibility to it. It had a certain way that I played. It had a certain interrelation between the care that I was doing for them and the aesthetics of that care. So what I started to realize as I was getting to the end of the book is that everybody during COVID and everybody in their everyday lives has micro moments where they have a sort of aesthetic of care in the work they're doing. It might be in how they're trying to teach their kids around the kitchen table during COVID. It could be the way they're looking after their family members, their elderly neighbors. What COVID, I think, revealed is this blurring of the boundary between the aesthetics and care. And at its best, being attuned to the aesthetics of those caring relations, I would argue, improves that care and made it more nourishing. So that's where I end the book. I'm now moving into a new project, which I can talk a little bit about, which is exploring how we might sort of research, document, and develop care aesthetics in relation to older people care and dementia. But that's a next stage. So I'd happily take questions about both the book or the next aspects of my work. But that's probably enough from me. Thank you all for listening so much, and please just ask me any questions, even difficult ones about Kant and the definition of aesthetics, which I will pass on to someone who's much better and more knowledgeable about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. And before we pull our finely honed philosophical knives out from the history of aesthetics, can I just invite Professor Michael Balfour from the University of New South Wales to provide a brief reflection and response as a way of drawing us into this communal conversation that your work sparks. I will repress myself from commenting further until after that's the case. I know that as I think Michael or someone put in the chat, that there's a lot of us who know each other now on this Zoom, and it's really lovely to see everybody, and there is a bit of a feeling of a community of practice in the many members of this particular event. But for those of you who don't know, Michael Balfour is not only Head of School and Professor of Theatre and performance at UNSW, but has a very impressive and distinguished background in applied theatre and performance work in a range of socially engaged contexts. And in addition to work in the background in the past in a number of settings, such as prisons, doing theatre and performance-based work, to supporting mental health of returning servicemen from Iraq and Afghanistan, and with newly arrived refugee communities, people with dementia. He currently has this fabulous project that I was interrogating him about called Future Stories, a collaboration with Queensland Children's Health, which explores what happens when you co-design virtual reality experiences with children in hospital using a medium that resonates often with them. So thanks so much and welcome, Michael, for starting us with a reflection on James's book.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks, James, for putting together that presentation. Really, really excellent kind of summary, of the book, and I believe, as a bit of product placement, there is a kind of a discount for anyone who's attending the event. And I think that will link within the invite, so please do make sure you kind of pick that up. And also just to say that, James rather rashly gave me my first job in academia way back in like the dark ages, when the Theatre and Prisons and Probation Centre was but a cupboard in the University of Manchester. And so it's, for me, it's really interesting to hear the kind of evolution of work. And we've also worked on the kind of In Place of War project and other things. But it's been really nice to kind of hear James's development in terms of the extent of his career. Because in a sense, I don't think care is anything new in his vocabulary. It's very implicit and explicit in all the writing that he's done and all the practice that he's done, because it features very strongly in the ways in which he carefully observed the work that he was doing in prisons, and also the ways in which he encountered the work across the different war zones and conflict zones in place of war. So for me, care is a kind of a weave of a word and a concept that's been very present, I think, throughout James's work and his writing as well. And I think it's really interesting in terms of, what I got from your presentation, James, was really looking at these examples of care, from the bell hooks quote about why do we speak about loss so much rather than love, and love being a really interesting word in academia that we all shy away from, but actually is a feature of a lot of the work, and everyone who's in the Zoom room, I think, in terms of the people that I know, is a kind of a feature of the ways in which we engage with the work. So I do think that the concept of care and of love is a feature in applied theatre, but that we have been very reticent about using such a thing. And I think that's why the book is really important, because it actually surfaces many of those things that are inherent in a lot of the work that we're involved in. And I love the term that you used about craft workers and the craft of care workers, because for me that really elevates some of the, for want of a better word, the mundanity or the intimacy of people who are working in caring situations. And in my experience of, say, working in dementia, some of the most beautiful examples was not just of artists working in those spaces, but actually of the people who are who have the cost of being a very task-based environment, and who are kind of economically driven by particular things and the ways in which they are set KPIs in terms of exactly how many patients they have to work with and what they have to do in the time that they're doing. But in between those moments where they are driven by those tasks and often oppressed by the kinds of nature of that emotional labor, there are real beautiful quintessential moments where, as you mentioned, there's really fantastic examples of love, of singing, of being with a person, of being present with a person, that I think is so important to kind of talk about and to acknowledge as well. And I think, again, some of the things that you were saying in the presentation, that care is not a fixed thing. Care is a personal thing, but care is also very political as well, both small p and big P. And I think those people in the health professions, and we were having a discussion about this with Meg this morning, just around the levels of stress and the levels of people departing the health industry just because of the pressures and the stress of wanting to care, but not having the economic or staff or skills or resources to care properly. And we see that frustration in healthcare. We see that frustration in people caring for disability, people caring for people in aged care. So it's a massive political issue as well. And I think I also really appreciated your thinking there about care as a form of radical practice, because in that kind of economic, cultural, social, political context, it really is a radical act to make space for a moment of care, not just the professional element of care. And I think certainly that concept of the intimate and the political and the dynamics and the tensions that is present in both an individual but also a corporate organization or a social care organization, and how those tensions can be navigated and negotiated. I think you've really articulated that incredibly well. And I think, I love the reference to the poet as well, Roger Robertson, and the concept of grace, because I think grace as a concept as well is very similar to love and to care. And I think grace is in those kinds of real small moments of intimacy, and in those small moments of taking a radical moment to do something graceful as a dynamic in a very particular relationship. And then that also, I think, speaks to your kind of referencing the question of attunement. It's so very difficult for any person, whether they're an artist or a care worker or craft person in those kinds of situations, to take the time to attune themselves to someone, to a person, and also to a situation, and to really take stock of that. And you see that time and time again in some of the relationships that develop, but it's actually very hard as well and very challenging for people to do that. And I think that concept of attunement is really key in terms of those notions of complicity between a patient and a carer in those kind of traditional concepts. And it's such an important element of those aesthetic relationships which you draw attention to. So look, it's really exciting, first of all, to kind of hear about the book and for you to kind of present today, but also I think also really exciting to know that you have a research project, which in a sense, I know from you talking earlier, is trying to test out some of these kinds of theoretical ideas in kind of real terms, and some of the practical work that you're going to be doing on the project. So it's fascinating, and we want to call you back in about a couple of years when we can hear about what you think about some of the kind of concepts that you set up. But certainly for me, they're really useful because they make explicit some of the things that we implicitly believe and understand about the practices that we are all involved in. So thank you so much, James, for taking the time.
And thank you, Michael. Look, at this point, I'm going to invite questions. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you have two methods of doing that. One is to use the reaction button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, and I and Anna will hopefully spot that and ask you to unmute. Or, of course, there's always the chat function, and there's more than one of us who can be present in the chat while James is speaking verbally to anyone who wants to ask a question at this point. So I'm going to invite questions now and see where we get to, and otherwise James can continue the conversation. I quite agreed with many of the things that you said, Michael, and of other things that I'd like to add to that sense of what might this book open up for the rest of us. So any questions or comments at this point? Yes, Rachel.
Hi everyone, thanks James and Michael so much for just reaffirming so much within my own practice as research as well, but also to reconnect with Australia as well. I had a question around some of the approaches to ethics of care that you employed as part of your own practice in terms of developing and writing the book. So maybe if you could talk a bit to maybe the framework or approach you might have used around that own ethics of care. You refer to obviously the work within feminist care discourses, but I wondered if there was an approach that you took within your work.
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, the book is very strongly, well, I'll go back a second. What I say in the book is I sort of situate the book in the history of the work on feminist care ethics. So it's very much writing, I would say, with the grain of much of that work. And then I would say that in the aesthetics work, I'm slightly working against the grain of some of the work in aesthetic theory. So there is a sense that the whole book is trying to place itself in that tradition. It draws slightly on more recent tradition in feminist care ethics around embodiment, because there's probably a lot of the work in feminist care ethics is quite theoretical and in some of its grounding features, but there is at its best an emphasis on practice as a source of ethical debate, and then embodiment as a place through which ethical debate is realized. So I sort of move off from the idea of practice and situatedness as a place from which debates within ethics become realized, not necessarily answered, but certainly that's the starting point. It's very odd to be writing insistently on embodiment and practice in my office. So that one of the dangers of this sort of work is this, and this is a product of COVID. I couldn't, I wrote this book and I couldn't go out of my house. So I think there's a sense that we need to avoid there is a sort of cerebral nature to some of the work that I've done in this book that probably needs to be slightly more embodied. But the approach that I was basically taking is drawing on that sense for the history of feminist care ethics to say that ethics can be found in the sort of relational dilemmas of care that people are faced with. I move away in the sense that there's quite a lot of the early feminist care ethics work that was based too much on cared for dyads, just the relationship between two people. And also some of the early work was somewhat essentialist in the sense that it's about mothering and sort of gender norms around who is the carer. Even though they were pointing out that women have been excluded from narratives of ethics, by placing women back in it, that at times there was a sense that women have some sort of natural capacity to care. And in this work, I'm trying to avoid some of the essentialisms that saying this is something that is only the product of a certain intuitive women's capacity. I'm not sure if that's answered you completely, Rachel. But...
No, it has. Thank you. I'd love to unpick more the kind of practice and situatedness aspects of it from a practice-based research point of view, but I'll leave it for now.
Well, let's come back to it maybe just in a minute. I'm going to read a question from the chat in just a second, but wanted to comment in relation to that I would be very interested in hearing you comment further about the affordances of different practices, because that is something that we are so interested in the general context of arts and health. What do our different arts practices afford us in terms of what comes out of them, or what we offer in them, or what might emerge that's changeable. But having just commented on that, I'll note that Kerry in the chat says, congratulations, James. A great introduction to key themes that you explore in the book. I was reminded when you were speaking that there is not only a politics of care, but a politics of aesthetics. Do you have any thoughts? And indeed, that's an excellent question.
Can I just come in? I'm working with James on the current project, and I just want to provide an example of what I'm talking about. And James was talking about, you know, the beautiful aspects and talking about them as aesthetic dimensions, and I know that he said already that there's, you know, been some criticism around that and so on, but I'm just really interested about the complexities of this current project and the complexities that are opening up, because yes, not only is this, you know, huge politics of care, but actually, yeah, the politics of aesthetics itself and how it gets named, how it's understood. And, you know, there's been a lot written on that, but just the interplay of those, I guess. Hope that's okay, James. You might not have any thoughts, but be good to hear them if you do.
Hi, Kerry. Thanks. It's really fun because I work with Kerry in the UK, and it's great to see you, Kerry, in an Australian context. It's really important to say that I tend to emphasize in the book aesthetics can be either descriptive or evaluative. So if you say it's aesthetic, you could be saying it's horrible, or you could be saying it's beautiful. But of course, in the book, I tend to focus on the evaluative aspect, that when I say aesthetics, I mean something good. Now that isn't only the case, because there's some really great writing. There's a woman called Hilary Moss who writes about the aesthetics of deprivation in healthcare practices. So it's really important to say that the aesthetics is used for the sort of sensory regime that is at play in any context, and it can mean deprivation, it can mean ugliness, it can mean abuse and appalling behavior and treatment and environments. So it's really important to say that the aesthetics has a double edge to it in terms of how it's being used. I would argue that if you start saying aesthetics in terms of the beautiful, or something that is sensorily nourishing, that is also disruptive. So there's an important politics of pointing to beautiful moments, not because they're just nice things, but because actually they often disrupt more ugly regimes. So in a care home that is struggling, and a care home that is maybe in a site which is predominantly one of deprivation, the moments of beauty stand out like sort of they're shocks to what's happening in that environment, and they reflect back on the deprivation that's in part of that environment. So when Michael's talking about those extraordinary small moments of beauty before, in terms of the aesthetic language, that's an aesthetic of disruption. We talk about Jacques, Rancière's work on aesthetics in that sort of sense. There is a real politics to aesthetics, both in the range from ugly to beautiful, but also that beauty disrupts certain regimes, the sort of sensory regimes as well. I hope that's answered something for Kerry.
Gillian says, and it's a continuation actually of what you've just said, some of your examples of everyday care aesthetics reminded me of descriptions of languages of love. And I'm wondering if you could say a little more about how care aesthetics can be differentiated from love languages, which are similarly experienced relationally.
Thanks, Gillian. I can't see. That is a great point. And in some way, I mean, I've written an article called "To Applied Theatre with Love," which is sort of my love piece around this sort of work. And for me, I think there are really important overlaps between languages of love and the languages of care ethics or care aesthetics. Where I'm sort of being more specific in care, partly because it emerges from health and social care. So there is a sense that it belongs to that particular field. And it's very specifically looking at the sort of, even though love is as well, I'm thinking of care partly because it's about a doing and a practice. Love can be that as well, but I'm interested in those relational acts where people are working with each other for particular reasons or purposes. So I think I sort of see love as a broader context in which care can be one aspect of it. The other thing about care, where it differentiates from love, is care can be done. There is care that is done by force. There is care that is part of voluntary and then paid for networks. There's something called care chains, which is the relationship between care in the context of, say, the UK, where someone's left the caring responsibilities in the Philippines to migrate to care work in the UK. So care also exists in sort of economically unequal relations. And so choosing care also tries to focus on care as a place of inequality, power differentials, which sometimes love doesn't capture in the same way, although it might. But it's an important overlap.
Can I return maybe selfishly while I see if anyone else has a question and puts their hand up to the interest in affordances of different practices through these aesthetics of care?
Can you explain a bit more, what do you mean by affordances in that context, Claire?
Well, so actually my introduction to this is from a chapter in a book you edited, and it's Hamilton's sense of care as part of care ethics but understood from a performance orientation. And since I was working in that context of healthcare and looking at the work that healthcare workers do, then thinking of those things as performances made a lot of intuitive sense. And one could see that certain kinds of performances perhaps enabled care to occur in some ways. And then in other conversations, there are people here from the Arts Health Network, New South Wales, who are all artists, and they have really different arts practices. And their really different arts practices might allow really different aesthetics of care or forms of care to emerge because the arts practices are different. And you're giving us, in a way, a conceptual vocabulary with which to work through how to understand that when that's maybe not been accessible to us before. So that's what I meant by affordances, really. The affordances might lie in the different practices that you use as a healthcare worker. They might lie in the different practices that you use as an artist, but they don't all do the same things. They let different things happen. How would you give us a conceptual vocabulary then for understanding that?
That's yeah, thanks, Claire, that's great. In many ways, I suppose, I think that there's of course very, very different things happen with very, very different art forms. And I suppose because I'm choosing to talk about care aesthetics, I'm sort of saying, take away the art form, what happens with people's hands, what different types of touch happen in this context, what are the physical relations between bodies, what's the use of voice in this particular work, what is the rhythm that happens in this context, how do bodies sit next to each other? And so because I'm trying to talk about aesthetic, I'm trying to find a language for the whole range of practices. And you might notice, then that actually sitting side by side with someone, not looking at them and humming and singing, creates a different aesthetic relationship between them than sitting in front of them and touching their hand. Inviting someone to hold a pen or a paintbrush has a different sensibility. So I suppose I'm trying to sort of get beneath the sort of formality of some of the different art forms to actually ask questions about what is actually happening. How do different art forms use touch? How do different art forms use the body in space? How do different art forms affect the environments in which they're happening? And when you ask those sort of questions, you also then are asking the same questions about a healthcare practitioner in that space, because the healthcare practitioner also is using touch, the rhythm of their body, the movements in space, the relationship between their bodies and other bodies. So it's trying to find a language for caring practice and language for aesthetic practices or artistic practices where you're borrowing from each other. And you can watch with a certain incredible sensitivity of touch, high level of technique, eye contact with the person, a tone of voice, a use of certain language and narrative, and maybe even storytelling, which has a certain way of, which I therefore think is an aesthetic as well as a technical practice. But it could be the same as someone allowing someone to hold a particular musical instrument in a certain way with a certain sense of grace and sense of rhythm and sense of attentiveness. So I suppose that sort of trying to answer your question to say that artists have very different sensibilities and different uses of their bodies. And it's trying to be really specific about what people do in those places. And different art forms have different types of practices, obviously.
Thank you. And I feel good about asking the question now because I see that there's been comments in the chat that your answer has inspired. Some of them are compliments, but I'd like to give the floor to Rand, who's stayed up very late, 3 hours later than this in Aotearoa, so and asks, I think Bell Hooks talked about love in relation to liberation. The end result of a practice of love was emancipation. What is the end result of a practice of an ethics of care? Is it self-sufficiency? The person being cared for can now care for themselves. It's a nice question in the context of feminist care ethics.
Hi, Rand. Nice to see you. It's interesting that I link some of the care ethics work to the work of Judith Butler, partly because we need a criticism of, we need to think through the ideas of power and care, obviously, and think about relations of care as both abusive and also perhaps emancipatory. And there's a range of different caring relations. And I actually am not so interested in self-sufficiency or autonomy in some ways, because even though, because I think a lot of versions of not all, but a lot of versions of autonomy and self-sufficiency seem to deny some of the caring relations on which most of our lives are based. So I wouldn't say self-sufficiency is an objective, but good quality networks of community solidarity and care are what help communities and relations thrive. We currently live in societies which do exactly that veer to exactly the opposite of that. So a sort of neoliberal vision of its successful individuals that hide the caring relations that allow them to be successful individuals, that champions sort of self-sufficiency without providing the material support to enable that to happen, is exactly the opposite to a care ethics vision of mutually supportive individuals and communities that acknowledge the support that we all need to live our lives at different points in our lives. So I think care ethics is a deeply liberatory, ambitious set of philosophical propositions that's admitting that we all need and we all give and need care in order to thrive and be successful, and we shouldn't deny that, and we should provide the infrastructures and the validations of those sort of processes.
Vic, lovely to have you join the discussion. If I can invite you to unmute and ask your question.
Thanks very much, Claire, and hi, James. I'm a colleague and a dear friend of Clive Parkinson, who's told me many stories about you and your relationship with me. I've worked with him for a number of years. I've just got my camera off because I'm in bed with a chest infection. So I had my camera off as an act of self-care for myself, but also wanted to ask you a question as part of self-care for myself. So it's maybe just a couple of points. So firstly, I'm a socially engaged artist who sees elements of sort of embedding myself into community contexts as part of my arts practice. And so, for example, what I mean is the negotiations that I have to undertake to be somewhere where an artist usually isn't. I don't understand them as processes I'm undertaking in order to enact my practice. I understand them as part of my arts practice, just as I do my sound editing or my sculpture or my performance, etc. And so I think that when we think about these sort of elements, such as those negotiations and then the actual act of care as being arts practice, rather than something to facilitate arts practice, it makes it really easy, doesn't it, to start bringing in conversations about aesthetics and all of these things into these when we see them as a creative act. And so I think it's really useful for us to be thinking about it in that way, because then it also opens up opportunities to think through things such as what are our art outcomes. And so, for example, I think, one of the greatest works I think I've made has been through working with the community, and what I deem as being an artwork has been the convincing of an irrigation company to remove infrastructure that a whole town feared would cause another flood that would destroy their town. So we made many artworks together that helped the coping process, but also me as being an artist there convincing that governing body to remove infrastructure as being an artwork. And so thinking through care ethics in this way that you're proposing helps in those sort of understandings and those explorations as well. But finally, the point I just wanted to make was the work I'm doing now, which is in a clinical space. What I'm finding is, and what I think is really fabulous from this work that you're making, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book, is I'm finding that within the clinical space, when I make an offer to participants who are the clinicians there about the aesthetics of their care, and even clinicians who might be a bit hesitant of the fact there's an artist in the room, it really enables a new conversation to happen with those clinicians about care. And so it enables a way to talk about the care they're giving within the clinical space in a very different way to talk about the aesthetics. And what I sort of understand is the tone of the conversation in the recorded conversations that I'm having with these clinicians is the whole sort of temperament of our conversation changes when I discuss care through the sort of aesthetics that you're talking about. And so I think it's really, exciting and fascinating work, because it will have that sort of really practical outcome of enabling those conversations in places where they don't normally happen.
Thanks for that, Vic. That's a fantastic comment. And just to pick up the idea, it's a very old conversation in socially engaged arts between, product and process. And you point out exactly that the process is the work. The process is an artistic practice, is an art form itself. And that's one of the emphases that I'm trying to make, that many people have made. But the final point you're making is absolutely the perspective that I've found in doing this work, is that rather than artists meeting a place where there is no art, an artist going into a prison, an artist going into, it's starting from a joint discovery of the aesthetic practices that exist in that place, some of which are done by the artists and some of which are done by the healthcare practitioner, some of which are done by the cleaner on the ward, some of which are done by the consultant. And it does enable a conversation. We've been doing some conversations by asking care workers, who are in the UK, some of the lowest paid workers in any context in the country, by asking them, tell us about the beautiful care you've seen in your workplace. And they look at you a bit perplexed for about 20 seconds. And then they immediately start pouring out these most amazing stories of beautiful care. So that there is something in this work that isn't difficult to understand. It is about that people do know what is beautiful care and also what is ugly care, and people enjoy that conversation, and it starts to provide a sort of much more equal conversation between practitioners, arts practitioners and healthcare practitioners, because you're starting to have a point of a similar point of sort of language, really. say hi to Clive next time you speak to him, obviously.
I'll be speaking to him this week, so I will. And thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Vic.
You can sort of probably say hi to Clive kind of from everyone
From
on
everyone.
the Zoom. Say.
I'll pass it on from everybody. Yeah.
Lots of love to Clive.
Indeed. Meg, I'm going to give you the phone. We are technically out of time at this point, so I'm going to give Meg the final question, and James an opportunity of a final statement, perhaps talking back to Michael Balfour, if you like. And then we'll close by asking Michael Anderson just to say a couple of words about the Create Centre. So Meg, you have a question?
Thank you, Claire. James, thank you as well. I really look forward to reading your book. A quick question, I suppose. I was thinking about Brecht, who's someone I've written and, observed a lot in terms of his theatre work. Whether here we have beautiful care in his work. Now, he's definitely a practitioner who engages with loss, the usual, Western obsession. And yet he also engages with love, clearly, and human reciprocal relations are very key. But he's also engaging a lot with discomfort and antagonism in his approaches to suffering, if you like, and moving beyond suffering and getting humans into more caring relationships. And I'm very aware of your approach in earlier writing towards Claire Bishop and her response to relational aesthetics, where she brings up the value of antagonism, if you like, and discomfort. And I'm just wondering, so to go back to my question, are we in the realm of beautiful care with folk like Brecht working with discomfort and antagonism? Can we be? It might be a better way of putting it. And when is that the case?
This is a long conversation.
Wrong question at the end of the.
It's a great question. It's a great question. People who know more about Brecht than I do will be able to answer. But I think that's a really good to think through the relationship between care and antagonism in Brecht's work. That's a fabulous route. And what you're revealing is that it's never as simple as going, let's focus on good care or beautiful care here, because care is often happening in highly conflictual settings, in antagonistic settings, and has a whole range of different dynamics that are part of it. And Brecht's work might be a really productive and rich sort of seam to look at in terms of the way he tracks care and its problems. I'm thinking of a number of, so I think that's really interesting. In looking at care, I obviously am writing quite strongly against some of what Claire Bishop would say, with no disrespect to her work,
yeah.
But not because antagonism is not important, but to say that if you start from that, or you expect antagonism, you can actually often forget the importance of care. It's not, and I sort of think we need to sort of, in a world that is beset by antagonism, particularly in the public world beyond theatres, we need to think a little bit more carefully about care as a response, and not necessarily start from the discomfort that some sort of philosophers assume is the automatic starting point for theatre practice or arts practice. I could say more, but I realise we're running out of time. Thanks for your comment.
Thank you very much, James.
Would you like to make any last comments, James, to draw this conversation to a moment where we can all leave it temporarily before taking it up in slower forms or written forms or at another occasion?
All I want to say is just a very big thank you to everyone who's come. It's really great to see some familiar faces and some new faces. If you do have questions, feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear people's responses to this work, the way it might be taken, but also criticism that people have. I appreciate it's you know, it's not a fixed idea or a final statement in any sense on this idea. So I'd look forward to those responses. And thanks again to Claire, Michael, and everyone who's hosted this event. It's been really enjoyable. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Gosh, it feels like just the beginning and just a teasing taster, which I guess is a great way to make us all go and use our discounts and acquire the book and create some spaciousness for reading it. Michael Anderson, can I invite you to close by just talking a little bit about the Create Centre? I'm assuming everybody knows much about it and is engaged with it, but really appreciative that it exists in order to afford events like this.
Yeah, thanks, Claire, and thanks, Michael Balfour, for his great responses, and of course to James for such a thoughtful and expansive kind of discussion on that book. I'm sure everyone's kind of really keen to dive into it, partly because I think it speaks into so many areas, not obviously not just in the health sector, but in education and all sorts of places. So I'm really looking forward to reading it and thinking about it and getting more into it. And of course, here's my product placement. If you liked this kind of conversation, there are many more like it on the Create YouTube site. And if you want to support and know what Create's up to, please just look in the links and you can join up to be a member. It doesn't cost anything. And you can be across all of the things Create's up to, and there's a fair few things coming up. So we'd love to have you coming back and engaging with this kind of work. But yeah, just thanks so much to James for that really insightful, really exciting exploration of the work, and really looking forward to hearing and seeing more. And we'd love to have you back in a few months' time when, or whatever, when that research starts to take on a life of its own. That would be fabulous.
Thanks so much, everyone, and have a lovely evening, a wonderful day in the UK, and a quiet night to all those in Australia or our area. And we'll see you next time. Good night.